It is 3 o'clock Eastern time, so as promised, we are going to go ahead and get started. I know that we will have other sPark attendees joining us as we go, but welcome to our session, Lessons to Learn in Education. We're so glad to welcome you all here to this part of sPark 2021. I'm Eva Feucht, I'm the director of the Park Scholarships Program. Today, we are going to hear from 3 terrific panelists about their expertise in education, and I'm going to give a very brief introduction of them, but a reminder that you can see a more detailed introduction and background on our panelists by looking at your virtual program. Today's speakers include Margaret Borden from the class of 2015. Margaret is a graduate research assistant on the PBI Global Education team at the Friday Institute at NC State University while she pursues her master's degree in math education. Welcome, Margaret.
Thank you.
Dr. Matthew Campbell from the class of 2005 is an assistant professor of mathematics education at West Virginia University. Glad to have you here, Matt.
Hi, everyone.
And Meredith Mason Street from the class of 2017 is a K-12 district academically and intellectually gifted, or AIG, specialist from Rutherford County Schools in North Carolina, where she has worked since 2018. Now, our moderator for today's session will be Beth Rogers from the class of 2022. So now I will turn it over to Beth.
Hello, my name is Beth Rogers. I'm the class of 2022, and I'll be moderating this event. And I want to go ahead and let you know that we welcome any questions in the chat. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and post them there. We would be happy to address those sooner rather than later. But I'll go ahead and start with our first question for our panelists to get us started while you think about your questions. And that is, what are best practices for gifted education? What are some of the effects of ability grouping on gifted students? And how do you advocate for your gifted students, or how do we teach gifted students to advocate for themselves? I'll ask Meredith to start.
Okay. Well, one, it is a very difficult question that I think I could probably talk all day about, but shortly, just kind of from my experience and what I've been learning so far in my gifted ed courses through UNC Charlotte, for the most part, there are a lot of things at odds in gifted education research with education research in general. And so I know that often ability grouping is a highly contested topic amongst educators and parents and students because of potential social emotional effects it may have on students when they learn how they're grouped. And a lot of research has been done, and I feel like you might hear me say this a lot, that there's no conclusive answer as to which is best or not. But research does show that there is no negative effect that would warrant avoiding grouping students by ability. And so when we talk about ability grouping, that can mean many different things. Whether you think about cluster grouping, where one teacher in a grade level is given all the students who are identified as academically or intellectually gifted, and that specific teacher has specialized training in how to work with those students. That's something that is pretty common in districts across North Carolina specifically, is to group in that way. But then you can get into more controversial ways of grouping, like tracking students and determining kind of their educational opportunities very, very early on for them based on how they're grouped. And another way of grouping would be to group based on blocks. So it's really common, especially in elementary schools, where you have teachers who take on one subject. So one teacher teaches math, reading, science, and social studies, and students are grouped into course based on academic ability. And so those are all very common practices that you'll see. They have their advantages and disadvantages for kids academically, but most research does show that there is no academic advantage for an identified gifted student to be in a classroom with students whose ability is significantly below theirs. So there are advantages for students and who are not identified as gifted, which is generally where we see the advocates come out and voice against ability grouping, because we want what's best for all students. And so sometimes that means that our gifted students are not given the most specific differentiation or challenge by grouping. Hope that makes sense.
And I want to add on to that with something that Meredith was talking to me the other day that reminded me of something I used to do in my class, which is ability grouping by standard. So what I mean by that is basically giving all students the opportunity to explore something at the same level when you first initially introduce the concept of the day or the standard. And then once you see kind of where students' understanding is of that standard, so let's use reading, for example. If you have all students reading different posters and you notice that some students are reading them really, really well and other students are a little bit slower, then you might group them by ability that day on that standard. And so they can be differentiated and the teacher can work with them in that situation. But then another day in the same class with the same students, you might be doing a math lesson and see that the really high readers were, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, Meredith, but the really high readers are reading or are not as strong in math, and some of the students that struggled with reading are much stronger in math. And so you change your groups. And then sometimes you might use the same exact reasoning to do mixed ability, where you put a high and a low in a group together so that they can teach each other and learn from each other. But socially and emotionally, the students get the opportunity to work with every student in their class and be in diverse conversations. And what we found at the high school level is in mixed ability classes, students who have maybe been traditionally scared. I teach math, so traditionally scared of math or traditionally afraid to share their reasoning, see other ideas that are popping up in the room from students who are much more confident with their mathematical ability and begin to use that vocabulary and learn much more and much faster. And so that's an argument for, that's why the advocates come out, right? Because that's an argument for your lower achievers that they're going to be pulled up by your higher achievers. But similarly, the research shows that if a student is able to teach what they know, they're more likely to learn it better and learn it stronger. And so when teachers are able to, one of my friends calls it deputizing your students, basically creating a whole bunch of you around the room. So when you find that your students who are high achievers, your gifted students, are learning, giving them opportunities to become leaders in the classroom with their learning and to teach other students or provide learning opportunities for other students in some other way, you want to balance introversion, extroversion, those kinds of things. But when you give your students those kinds of opportunities, it not only is benefiting the taught student, but also the teaching student, because they will learn a whole lot better when they get the opportunity to teach it.
I would add that part of what complicates, so Meredith mentioned there's sort of being mixed evidence of what good practice is in this. I think what complicates that or leads to that mixed evidence is the fact that it's not just what are the best practices for individual learners in a vacuum, but it's the way in which the identification of students as, say, academically and intellectually gifted is fraught with various biases and inequities, which include what research knows as the advocacy that certain demographics of parents do on behalf of their students. And that those parents are typically white and typically middle and upper class. And that when you know the system that you want your child to be successful in, you can advocate and have the affordances to advocate on their behalf. And that leads to identification of students in ways that are not necessarily exclusively linked to academics or intellect. So that's one thing that complicates this space. Another is the way in which that acceleration happens. And in a subject like math, that might just include students skipping an entire course or compressing 2 courses worth of material in 1 year. And in a way that actually reduces the rigor and complexity of what those students are working on in a way that may actually cause problems down the line. In the case of math, if they wanted to enter a STEM field in college, that they might not have actually had as good of a preparation just because they were accelerated. And the last thing, and I'll build on what Margaret was saying, is that part of what we would want to see more of in any math course, again, for example, is more discourse about mathematical thinking. And so you could say who's in the room and who benefits from who, but the actual practice of what it means to engage in mathematical reasoning is something we don't see enough in math classrooms at any level and would need to see more of, and all students would benefit from that, regardless of the kind of homogeneous or heterogeneous tracking of the courses themselves.
Thank you all. Those were insightful answers to a very complex issue. I invite everybody to place any questions that come to mind in the chat, but I will move on to another question that is very important in the field of education right now, and that is teacher recruitment and retention. What is the nature of the teacher shortage across the country, and what is known in research policy about addressing shortages?
Well, I could start on this. Some of my research is around, some of my work as an educator is particularly with secondary math teachers and the act of trying to recruit and retain teachers, but also doing research on the nature of the teacher shortage, particularly in the context I'm in, which is in West Virginia, predominantly rural context. So a lot of the research on teacher shortages has been done in urban context, and it's kind of not surprising at this point that the supply of new teachers does not meet the demand for new teachers, either created through retirement or pre-retirement departures from the profession. And so now in a state like West Virginia, where we have a declining population, it's not because of the creation of new positions. It is purely because of teacher departures. And we are, the supply is not keeping up with the demand. What that problem looks like in a rural context is very different than it would in an urban context, where you're more likely to see initiatives like alternative certification or something like Teach for America, where you have more concentrated areas of where the schools are and where the students are and where the positions are. That problem is very different in rural contexts, also about what we know about who is most likely to go to the places that are in where the schools are that need teachers. So that's one thing that's sort of interesting. The other is there's such attention on teacher recruitment. How do we get more people into the classroom? How do we modify the pathways in which they can get certified or whatever? But if we curbed the departure of teachers from the profession, especially people who are leaving not because they're retiring, that almost on its own would address the teacher shortage in this country. So the fact that teacher retention is in such a spot that we're losing so many teachers, there really needs to be more attention to how we keep the teachers we already have in ways that address their job satisfaction or their feeling of their own preparedness to do the job.
Yeah, so I want to add on to that and actually speak to something that Matt is working on with his research. So he may need to jump back in and keep talking about it. But this idea that he talked about of teacher job satisfaction, I think that's a really hot topic, especially amongst young people who believe that they can find a different avenue to work in their career and make career adjustments. I'm a prime example, to be honest. I am a graduate student now and looking to continue in math education, but not from the classroom. And it is possible if and I can't say for certain because I've never been offered this kind of opportunity, but if, say, an opportunity were to exist where I could work with one class of students and then work with teachers for the rest of my day, because what I love to do is work with math teachers, then I would return to a school. Who knows? And I would still be in a position to work with students and be in the classroom regularly and teaching students as well as teaching teachers. that does not really exist right now. I know Matt is working on a project, and there are some professors at NC State who are working on a project, and some policymakers and some advocacy leaders all out there through organizations such as Best in C, which is a nonprofit that connects businesses, educators, and policymakers to each other to try to solve some of these major issues like teacher retention. But there's this idea that people have come up with, and again, I'm going to defer to Matt to give us more information on it, but teacher ladders or career ladders, which refers to the concept that in other professions, you have somewhere to grow. You come in at the base level, and then you learn skills and you're mentored, and then you move up and you gain different responsibilities that you are still doing within your contract hours. In the teaching profession, however, you start your career doing exactly what you will be doing 35 years later in your career. And places for gained responsibility and gained leadership opportunities is normally added on to your teaching contract hours or taken away from your planning period. And so all of a sudden you have people who are, yes, much better at their job as a teacher, so maybe not spending as many hours preparing for day-to-day class, but still working way too many hours past their contract hours. And I use that term just because it's one that's regularly used in the teaching profession. But this idea that we're asked to work a solid 8-hour day and then actually find ourselves working 10 to 12 hours unpaid because we work in a profession where we are trying to be prepared to be the best educators that we can be for our students. And if you find the opportunity to be a leader in some other capacity in your school, you're most likely not being paid very much, if any, to do that work. And you are not given any time extra in your day to take care of that work. And so you are simply staying after to take care of it after school. And that is something that we've done for many, many years, but is not necessarily the best strategy for keeping teachers. And so there are different creative ladder opportunities and ways that people are thinking about shifting those responsibilities, people like Matt and these advocates that I've been talking about, so that teachers like myself who are looking to gain leadership opportunities, gain more responsibilities, even earlier on in my career, can do so and still be in a classroom working with students and making differences in student lives, in addition to other things that I would get to do with my my career.
Mario kept throwing the ball my way, but I'll let Meredith jump in. Plus, I just got a coffee delivery.
So I guess as Margaret was talking, one reason that the job that I'm currently in appealed to me, even though this is not my career path plan whatsoever, was that I still get to work with students and I still get to mentor and coach teachers. So I'm kind of in best of both worlds, where I have resource setting gifted classes in K through 5, and then I do more social emotional work with students in grades 6 through 12. And if you kind of think about the model of our park block, that's kind of what our AP Academy in our county is like, or the goal that we have for it. So that's my role across K through 12, but then I'm also working with teachers. And it's not an elevation in pay or anything like that. So I guess you could say I've taken on a district leadership role where I make decisions at a level for my county along with my 2 other colleagues, but increased responsibility. But it's also a trade-off of there's no EVOS data tied to me. I'm not responsible for daily grades. And so in a lot of ways, where I used to spend my time at work as a classroom teacher, sometimes till 6:30 at night, and then I would come home and work more. And as a young teacher, I was finding that that was not sustainable for me. I couldn't picture, when my family grows, what will this look like for me? How will I keep doing this? And when I made this jump into this role unexpectedly a couple of years ago, I found myself that I'm not having to take things home anymore, even though I have increased responsibilities. But the way that this role is set up for me, and our local director of digital education, a lot of time is given that I can do things during the day. And sometimes that perception from other teachers may look like I'm sitting on a computer all day, but really I'm analyzing data and making identification decisions and doing a lot of behind the scenes work that people don't see to my job. So I will say one thing Margaret and I talked about briefly last week was that I feel like with teacher retention and recruitment, as a student in my high school who was academically gifted and very successful, obviously since I went to NC State, my teachers, when I told them in high school that I was going to become a teacher, were not happy with me. And I faced a lot of backlash, and even from my mom, who was the former superintendent in my county. And it took a long time for her to come to terms with it. And then that was one thing that she talked about was, I didn't even want my own daughter to become a teacher, but here I am trying to recruit teachers. And so it's not typically the career that we push our best and brightest to, although I'm kind of from the standpoint of that's who I want teaching my kid. If it's not good enough for my kid, then it's not good enough. So.
Awesome. Our next question is from the chat, and it says, the trend in our area is to wait to start children in kindergarten until they are 6, especially in higher income families. Can you comment on this practice and the impact it's having on classrooms and equity in them?
I can take this one. This is something that we deal with often, especially in gifted education, is that you have families who tend to retain children, and their concern might be maturity, or they maybe have specific friends they want them to attend school with for whatever reason. But when we see these kids come in, they typically have a high level of support at home. So they've already mastered a lot of kindergarten standards and content, and then they come in where they would have already been ahead if they started on time. Now they're even further ahead. And so you have this subset of students who come, like to my classes for talent development, but then by the time they're in 3rd grade, that's caught up to them and that extra support from home. And then they're performing on an average level compared to their peers, where when they first started school, they were, in the 90th or higher percentile. And so you find that that leads to more discouragement for the parents really than anyone, that they believe their child was so, this high ability and capable, and it doesn't mean that they aren't, but they were just prepared much more at home for school compared to peers on the starting level. And that tends to create a problem as you have mixed ability classrooms with students, that you have students who have mastered the content already, and you're trying to figure out what you do with them while you teach everyone else. So.
Yeah, my perspective on this is partly as a parent of a current kindergartner, and one who started when she was almost 6, but that was because of the state policy that the cutoff here in West Virginia is July 1st. Her birthday's in September. And so in a way, she benefits from what was essentially a year more of pre-K, daycare, whatever, which again is an affordance that we were able to pay for that daycare for that extra year of her life. West Virginia does have universal pre-K, which is a great thing, but that too is on the same timeline. So you have, in some cases, if a child is born, say, August 1st, they might not start pre-K until they're 5 years old or almost 5 years old, because of that cutoff, and then start kindergarten when they're almost 6, or right about 6. So in some ways that equalizes that phenomenon, but you certainly have this red shirting idea of children for reasons that include, well, I want my child to be the biggest person on the sports field when they hit middle school, or for some of the perceived academic advantages, though the trade-off is that you then get hit with the crude reality when that catches up in some way. You also have the case of, where we're going to have 19 and 20-year-olds graduating high school, and what are the social and emotional and kind of trade-offs there. So it's something that I recently, and partly, and this is further conflated with COVID and the interruptions to school over the past 13 months. Do you hold kids back? Do you do redo years? So it's interesting to think about the possible benefits of that to an individual, possible drawbacks to that to an individual, but also the sort of systemic and structural inequities that perhaps let that be an option for certain people who then benefit from those possible benefits.
I want to speak to kind of the other end of what Meredith was talking about with the catching up in third grade and becoming average for students that truly are gifted and starting later and are just continue to be ahead of their peers in all of their classes, maybe even skip a grade or become accelerated. We are starting to experience in the middle and high school levels this push to offer our students higher level courses is happening a lot in math classes with this perceived need for students to experience more math to be able to get into college, among other reasons, but that's one of the main reasons that's spoken of. And it's created testing out of classes in places like Chapel Hill. I know they have that county has developed exams that you can take and literally test out of an entire course, meaning that you've got some students who are taking high school level courses. So in North Carolina, we have Math 1, Math 2, Math 3, and now Math 4 happening in the high school level courses. And those are integrated courses that are designed for high school math, integrating what used to be Algebra 1, Algebra 2, geometry, statistics, and advanced functions and modeling. And now what is occurring is more and more students, especially students with parents that are advocating for them, so typically predominantly white and predominantly middle and upper class, like Matt mentioned earlier, are taking Math 1 and Math 2 in middle school and coming into high school and taking Math 3. Some high schools can't even support math past statistics, so they're hitting their junior year and no longer have a math course to take, so they're having to either go take a college course and be off campus and not with their peers in high school, or the schools are having to figure out how to offer different math courses that they've never offered before. So they're not being taught quite as well as maybe they should because the teachers aren't trained to teach them, but they need these math courses. Or you've got block scheduling, so they're doubling up on their math. And so students are not able to take things that are more interesting to them, like electives that, now, I'm not here to, I mean, we are Park scholars, so there are people in here who love to take math as their elective, and that is awesome if that is your choice as a student. We are not seeing that in most cases. Most cases, students are taking math. And again, Matt and I are both math educators, so we do kind of see it from the math perspective mostly. So I'm sure this is also happening in other courses, but it seems to be really, really strong in STEM courses, especially in math courses, because of this perception that if you take more math, you'll be better off in college and you'll look better for college. And so students are that you're being affected socially and emotionally, you're being affected with your creativity, what you're interested in doing, because you're taking courses that are, quote, padding your resume, if you will. But anyone who's been on the selection committee for the Park Scholarship knows that those are not necessarily the things that we care about as a scholarship, and also not necessarily what matters when you are becoming a human. Academics are great in their right, but there are 4 pillars to this program, and I believe this program represents very much what it means to become a strong citizen, a strong human, a strong professional. And so you need more to who you are than academics, and this push to get your student high, like be the highest in the class and the biggest on the team, and the whatever advantage you can give them, in some ways makes a lot of sense, and in other ways is detrimental to our kids, especially socially and emotionally.
So I'll argue the flip side of that from the gifted perspective, is that I think what we see happening with this is that you have parents pushing for their child to be in these classes when that's truly not what is developmentally appropriate for these child. So I think these advanced mathematical opportunities were born out of the need for students who truly do need acceleration. And when Margaret was talking about students who took high school math in middle school. That was me. Kyle Bingham in my class also, we're from the same county. We were the first group in our county to go through with Algebra 1 starting in 7th grade. And so when we got to high school, we took calculus A, B, B, C, and statistics. And I think we fared okay, but that's not to say that that's the right path for every student. And I think you have a lot of parents who view, well, this track is being offered for kids and it's my kid failing if they're not in it. And so you have a lot of kids who get pushed into that based on the perception of what it means if they're not in those tracks. And so, we still offer those in Rutherford County, but we call them plus courses now. And we have a lot of disagreement amongst teachers and school staff of, do we communicate that to the parents or not, that their kid is in this compacted curriculum classroom, because what will that do to them socially and emotionally? And so there are subsets of kids who do truly need that to avoid experiencing underachievement because they're not motivated and they're not challenged. But that percentage of students is actually very small compared to the percentage of students who get thrown into those courses. And so, what we tend to see is that our gifted students here locally are pushed into it and they attempt it and it's a terrible experience for them. And then they're done with all academic challenge whatsoever. And they want to take the easiest path possible, or you have kids that it's truly appropriate for and it's a positive experience for them.
And whether it's kindergarten and 6-year-olds in kindergarten, or that sort of acceleration and pathways that go further and further into the course sequences, there's then the phenomenon that what is perceived as average or normal or on track gets skewed. And I don't know the solution to that, to then also maintain the benefits of the individualized plans. But what gets seen as kind of the middle, what's on grade, on track, then gets really messed up, because people constantly think, well, my kid should be in the more accelerated track. And then certain people seem to be more successful in ensuring that.
So our next question is there any research that discusses the impact of grouping or tracking on youth's non-academic skills, like understanding of diversity, self-discipline, or future preparation? I ask because many tracked schools students rarely interact with others outside of their classroom.
So the research I have seen recently, which is PBL related, does show that students who are given the opportunity to be in a mixed ability classroom, so non-tracked classroom, which I want to make sure that we're talking about this a little bit differently, because we made the distinction when we were discussing this on Friday together, that ability grouping really generally happens inside the classroom, and then tracking happens across classrooms. And so we are not here to advocate for tracking, and we are here to say that ability grouping can and sometimes should be used for the benefit of students when necessary. And there's not really conclusive evidence on what is best, which is why it's kind of best to do a little bit of everything. However, tracking is pretty, I don't want to use too strong of language that I can't back up with a research article, but essentially what I've read is tracking does not help students from the other side of things. Honestly, it doesn't really help students at all in any way, I don't think, from what we've seen. I think, and it's a very, very contentious issue in some ways, but it's simply not conclusive that it pulls down the top. And in some ways, it provides the top students with an opportunity to experience diversity and experience other perspectives and experience leadership opportunities within their classrooms. And it certainly is beneficial to the bottom. So that's why advocates are pretty strong-minded about it. But yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on, Ashley. I think there's certainly some positive effects to being in diverse rooms with lots of different perspectives, and with the ability to experience diverse behaviors and diverse ways of approaching the world from wherever you come from in the way you were raised. So I'll stop talking and let my colleagues add on.
I mean, all I would add, Margaret was kind of searching for the ability to be strong in a comment. I mean, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics and some of their recent guidance, a series of publications called Catalyzing Change, have come out incredibly strongly against tracking in mathematics, which is where we see a lot of this happening in its sort of most extreme sense. And so that organization, which has been behind many of the standards movements in math education for the past 35 years, has come out pretty strongly against that. And again, I think Margaret's clarification is important. That's talking about tracking in terms of separate classes and degree and sort of diploma earning pathways, not necessarily what you might do within a classroom that is heterogeneous.
Okay, so our next question is kind of a combination of two. And it is, do you think COVID will cause the gap to grow even more between students with highly engaged parents and those without? If so, is there a plan to catch these students up? And in addition, how can people outside of the classroom without educational training help students to meet the educational and emotional needs that they may be lacking in this world of remote learning?
I don't know if there's a plan. I'll start there, because I think the answer to the first question is yeah. You look not only at support at home, you have, it's perhaps correlated with, do you have internet at the home? Do you have enough computing devices to support everyone in the house, including adults who may be working? Are the parents working in the house or not? And so the longer students went without the sort of great equalizer, so to speak, of being in the classroom, those inequities are certainly prone to being exacerbated. What are the plans? I mean, my concern would be that you're going to see some students really put through the grinder over this coming summer, or it's going to be, it has to be more time. We have to catch people up. We have the phrase learning loss. Well, loss compared to what, right? We made up the rules. We would then be deciding what students are falling behind from. And so to not take a holistic view of what's in the interest of students and our communities would be ill-advised, but I would not be surprised if you see solutions, so-called solutions, that are about making up time, making up content, catching people up. And I would not think that that's going to help.
So currently, North Carolina legislature has mandated summer school opportunities to be provided to students. And it's different from where we typically offer reteach and retest opportunities for EOGs with elementary students, or we did chief programs in K through 3. This would be a more extensive type of summer school for them. And as a county, we've had very few teachers volunteer to run it, because we're all kind of from the standpoint of, I think as a county, we've adjusted our expectations for students this year. We're a 1-to-1 district. Every student has an iPad or a MacBook, and so does every teacher. But internet is a problem. We're in the foothills. We're a rural community, high poverty area. And so a lot of our families don't have internet. And that's been a huge struggle over the past several months is, they have the device, but they can't doesn't do much good if they don't have that live connection to Zoom with their teacher. And so we've had a lot of challenges facing where we're teaching kids in the parking lot with their remote teacher. And I've done that several times this year, or we're recording lessons and they're coming and downloading it, or doing school at midnight in the parking lot of their school. So there are several different hurdles, but I think as a county, we've just tried to look at, we don't expect them to be where we would normally expect a third grader or a 12th grader to be. It's a completely different environment. And we also have a lot of high school students who are choosing to be remote and work during the day. So there's just a lot of interesting things going on. And I think there will be a gap if we make it be a gap, or we make it be behind, like as Matthew was talking about. We're the ones creating that, not the students.
I also just want to really add and get on my soapbox a little bit here because I've got a thesis on it on Thursday. But I think that there are a lot of innovative methodologies, teaching methods out there that have been seeking to close this gap, if that's the phrase you want to use, or provide opportunities for all students in one room to get what they need. And one of those teaching methodologies is project-based learning. And project-based learning is this idea that students engage in relevant, authentic contexts that are connected directly to what they're supposed to be learning with their standard or their content or their whatever it is the learning goal is for that day. And they are exploring things that are interesting to them, and they can do so at whatever level of depth they are capable of, and teachers are able to facilitate that. And I think more than ever, innovative practices like these that have been advocated for many, many years now, but maybe will be hopefully more advocated for now that we have experienced such a challenging year and a challenging time together as a humanity. Something like project-based learning, which is not typical in most classrooms right now, I believe wholeheartedly should be typical in most classrooms. And those of you out there who know a lot about PBL and know that it's often said not to do in math class, that's why I wrote a thesis on it. And that's why I will be showing up at as many conferences as I can to talk about how you can use PBL in the math class, because I think it's really important. I think it's important that our kids have the opportunity to engage in practices and learning and education that is going to reflect what they will be doing when they get into a career setting in a Google world. And I don't believe we're doing that right now. The way that I was taught in school at NC State, we were. The way I was taught in high school, we weren't. Okay, so like you have to push past, teachers will have to push past experiences of how they were taught. Parents will have to push back or push past experiences of how they were taught and accept that when we were in school, Google was not in our pockets, period. I mean, I was having to pull out my computer. I'm not that old, honestly, but I was still in college having to open my computer in the middle of campus and connect to the Wi-Fi to check my emails because I did not have it in my pocket. Our kids, they have knowledge literally in their pockets. And so the concept of having to memorize 1,000 things and have them at the tip of your brain all the time is simply not useful to them anymore. Sure, there's a base, but there's so much more that they're going to need to be able to do because computers can do what we've been teaching for so long. So I'll get off my soapbox because I see Eva, but I think that's going to be one of the ways to approach this. So if you're out there advocating for a plan, talk about PBL.
Thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to all of you for coming today. We hope to see you at our next event, which is at 4:30 p.m. Eastern time. Eva, and there's more information about those events in the virtual program, and I'll pass it to Eva.
Yes, I know we're all giving a warm Zoom appreciation to our panelists. Thank you very much for your insights. And thank you, Beth. I don't know if we said it out loud, but Beth is majoring in education, a future teacher. So Beth is part of the front lines of addressing some of these things that were brought up today. As is, I believe, we in the Park Scholarships program, and we certainly incorporate some of the things that were spoken about here in the ways that we train our selection committee and the work that we do. So if you receive that invitation and want to come and help us read applications and interview and hold us accountable for that, I hope that you will do it. So we'll see you at 4:30 for brain teasers for the body. It will not be recorded and you can turn your camera off, says Deb Call, but we're going to move and learn and think. So we'll see you all then. Thanks, everyone.